Hey guys, I am Brandon from Sasquatch B Studios, and I make video games and videos about making video games, just like my friend here, DaFluffyPotato, or some of you might know him better as just Fluffy. So, how's it going, man? Thank you so much for joining me, by the way.
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, if you're cool, let's just dive right into it. And so, just for people who do not know who you are, they're not familiar with your YouTube channel, do you mind just telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do? Are you part-time, full-time? Do you work completely solo? Yeah, all of that.
Yeah, so I my YouTube channel, which is what most people know me from, is it's game development and tutorials and anything related really. So I focus specifically on using Python and Pygame, which is an unusual combination, especially for game development. But I make tutorials specifically for I've done some Python specific stuff, and then I more specifically get into Python and Pygame, but there are some broader topics in there as well. And then I also cover some more general game development topics as well. So my most popular video was why I'm glad I didn't use a game engine. But um,
I just watched that one this
so
morning.
yeah, so um, there were a lot of people that didn't like that video. It was a bit poorly worded because people thought that people misunderstood what I was trying to say because of the way it was framed. Because I was originally speaking to my intended audience, and one of the things that happens with YouTube is sometimes you'll be trying to speak to the audience that you already have, and then it just promotes it like crazy, which is
Yep.
what happened there. I was expecting to get like what 5,000 views, and I got like 600,000.
Yep.
So the people that weren't my actual audience misunderstood it, and that's part of the reason it blew up. But that was funny. But I have other videos that aren't like super Python related. They're more game development related, and just talking about that stuff as well. But my skills are actually more so in programming and game development.
Okay.
My YouTube channel is more of a byproduct of everything else that I do. I don't actually put too much time into making videos. I like to make interesting things and then make videos based on that. And that's a kind of philosophy that I've seen a lot of other game development YouTubers shifting towards. But yeah, that's what I've been doing on YouTube. And then, like I said, I specialize in game development. That's where I got my, well, that's where most of my skills are.
Yep.
And then I'm not actually full-time game development. I'm not full-time anything really. So I'm a student. I am getting a bachelor's in computer science. I'm
Nice.
finishing this year actually.
Good for you.
Uh, and I, I've had jobs as well. So I've always done game development on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And I treat it like a hobby. I make money from it, but I do it in my extra time for fun.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
that's where I'm with that. And then the jobs that I've had, I've worked in the aerospace industry on both flight simulators, and then I worked on parts for rockets. And surprisingly, game development transfers to those things very well. I'm constantly changing how I balance out my time, but I'm doing all sorts of things all the time, and I'll just put whatever on my YouTube channel. So that's, I guess, the big summary of what I do. That's a bit longer than I intended.
Yeah, no
Yeah.
worries. Hey, that's really cool. This is so, and it's funny because like I said, I watched your video this morning on why you don't use a game engine, and I really liked the video. And it made me laugh at the beginning because you said
Yeah.
at the time you had like a, I can't remember the number, it was like a 30-minute time limit for playing games each day. So to kind of go against that, you're like, oh well, if I'm making games, then I get to play a lot longer than that because I'm doing something creative, right? So is that is there any like, because I'm always curious, is game dev something that people that you were always interested in getting into, and just how about did you get started in this industry? Because I saw that video just this morning. So is that kind of how you got started with all of this? It was kind of just like almost like a little rebellious thing against your parents, or was it, is there anything, did it go further back than that?
Well, it wasn't supposed to be rebellious or anything. It was more like uh, I just wanted to play more video games. But I mean, a lot of it was that I was like I got into programming because I was bored, and also because I didn't. Funny enough, I didn't think at that time that I was smart enough to actually make games. Um, so that was just kind of a side thing where it was that I like if I could make games, it would be really cool if I could just make games and then play as much as I want. So that's how that one ended up. But um, I primarily got started in programming because I was just bored. So, and then I immediately once I started programming, the first thing I was doing was making like little text-based games and stuff. And then a couple months later, I got into Pygame, and that's kind of what I've been using ever since. I learned a lot of other stuff to make games with, but I still use Pygame mostly. And um, yeah, so that's how I got into things.
Hmm.
I just kind of scaled up over time. I had a time period where no one was really looking at my stuff, and I wasn't really in any communities, so I kind of had a slump for a while where I didn't really do much, and then I just because I didn't have much else to do, I eventually came back to it again. So I mean that 30-minute rule definitely contributed to it because either way, whether it was to play games or to just have something so that I wasn't bored, it helped because otherwise, if I didn't have that limit, I could have just been playing video games to begin with, and I probably wouldn't have gotten into programming at that time because I was 12 back then. That was 10 years ago.
Okay.
So
It's hard to be
yeah,
bored when
I
you're
think
programming.
yeah, I think I would have eventually gotten into programming just because of my other interests. But I think it would have been maybe 4, 5, 6 years down the road if it weren't for that.
Gotcha.
So yeah,
Gotcha. I excuse me. I was just kind of perusing through your YouTube channel, and it seems like you like to do a lot of pixel art and 2D
yeah,
side-scrolling stuff. So are there any games that primarily like inspired the types of games that you like to make?
yeah. So uh, I think some of the first games I played were on the Game Boy, like Game Boy Advance. So it had color. Um, so I think I'm not sure if this is the first video game I played. It was one of the first, at least like one of the first I think it was the first handheld console game I played at least. Was Fire Red. So that's pixel art. And a lot of games that I first initially played around then were I had pixel art, so I played Red Rescue Team and a couple other things. And then uh, even when I got my own computer and everything later on, and I could play desktop games, I didn't have a computer good enough to run most of like the fancy 3D games and stuff. So I was still playing a lot of 2D games and stuff like that. So it was just kind of the games I was around were pixel art, and I grew to like that art style. And then I think some of the more modern, like popular inspirations that I can think of are early on I was inspired a lot by Fez and Hyper Light Drifter, which have completely different art styles, but they actually have the same composer, which is funny. Um, and then for the smaller things that had a bigger impact, it was there's two game developers that did a lot of game jams, some of which I participated in. One of them was Daniel Linson. He's best known for his game Rogue Light, and that's light as in like a light bulb,
Okay.
where you're like an archer and you like your arrows light up the area around you. But he made a lot of other games that had a nice pixel art style that I took inspiration from. And then someone else I took even more inspiration from, who's probably my biggest inspiration in the earlier days, was RXI. He won a lot of. I don't know if he won the Ludum Dares, but he got a lot of medals in the Ludum Dares, especially for his artwork, I think. And he did a lot of pixel art stuff too. And I don't think he really does Ludum Dares anymore, which is the game jam that he primarily participated in.
Yep.
But funny enough, my last game jam entry, which was for the Ludum Dare, was a game that, like, and I say this in the entries page, that is kind of artistically inspired by one of RXI's games from like I don't know, it was like a decade ago, uh, and I ended up getting first place in graphics. And actually, not only did I get it in compa, which is where you just make a game in 48 hours by yourself,
Yep.
but I also got a rating that was higher than everyone in the jam category, which is where there's teams and you get more time. So,
Really?
yeah.
Holy crap.
Out of all of the 2,000 or so entries in that Ludum Dare, I actually beat all of them in graphics. So,
It's a badge of pride you
that
get to
was
wear then.
yeah. So, but that came like it was like I mentioned, it was artistically inspired by RXI. I mean, you can tell if you can look at the games and see we have very different art styles at this point. But if you look back at my older games, you can see they're similar. And that's kind of where my stuff has come from artistically. It's just a lot of inspiration
Did you
from
get
other stuff.
did you get into pixel art after you started programming, or is that something you kind of did for fun before?
So I got in afterwards. I was since I was 12, I couldn't hire like someone to do artwork for me or anything. So I figured, hey, might as well just figure out myself. And you can look at some of my older pixel art, and it's pretty rough. Actually, it's a bit harder to find some of the stuff from like 2013, but um, I very slowly improved over time. I think if you look at a lot of pixel artists who specialize in that, you can see that they improved a lot quicker than I did. But I think I've figured it out a fair bit over time. Uh, and it's just a skill that I developed as I've made games. And an option would have been to use like pre-made game assets, but I prefer the artistic control. So just right from the beginning, I wanted to do it myself.
Yep. So just learning through trial by fire kind of
Yeah.
thing.
And that's how I learn pretty much everything. I usually learn things when I have a need to use them. So for a lot of programming stuff, I won't pick it up unless I have a reason to use it.
Gotcha.
So for a while, my skill set remains actually pretty small. And even though I've had random projects here and there nowadays where I've actually learned tons of different technologies and languages and stuff, I'm using Python most of the time because I can make it work and it's actually much more efficient to develop in.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because, as you even said it yourself, using Pygame is not something that you hear about too often. Like the only other person that I watch fairly regularly is Code Bullet, and I wouldn't call him a traditional game developer. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He likes to do
Yeah.
AI stuff, and I don't know if he still uses Pygame, but it certainly was a thing that he relied on a lot in the past. And it's just something you don't hear about too much. So I'm just curious as to what led to that decision, and have you ever? I know that I think I saw on your YouTube channel you've used Godot maybe once or twice for like a jam.
Yep.
But have you considered using an engine outside of that, or you seem to like Pygame? Just kind of explain that a little bit to me.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I did get started with Pygame in like 2013 when I started programming, and it was just what was the main option for game development with Python at the time. Another option was Pyglet, but it was I think already starting to lose popularity, and it has like almost no one using it nowadays. And
Ah,
Pyglet's like the OpenGL version, and like it's an interface kind of for OpenGL and some other stuff in there. Whereas Pygame is a wrapper for SDL, which is what a lot of people use if they're making games with C++ for some of the simpler stuff. Uh, if they're not directly using like OpenGL, or if they're not using like a bigger engine or something. But it's pretty common for certain types of applications, and I mean like applications, not necessarily game development stuff. So it's used for all sorts of things. In SDL, the main thing is that you get to just put images on top of images and do basic transformations and stuff. So one of the things that distinguishes Pygame is that you're working on a very low level. There's no physics, there's no particles, there's no animations. There is collision detection for like certain types of shapes that you can do,
okay.
but there's no way to resolve actual collisions, so there's no actual physics. So it's mainly just here's some shapes. You can maybe collide them and see if they are colliding. Here's some functionality for like putting an image on the screen. You can play a sound, look at what the keyboard's inputting, and that's basically the type of thing that Pygame is capable of. Everything else you have to build up from there.
Wow.
So I think I mentioned this in that my most popular video, which I think you just watched, and uh, Pygame is great for like learning if you're planning on going into computer science
Yep.
or like just software engineering in general, because you get a lot more general experience with programming since you're building all this stuff from scratch. And
Python's
then,
one of the most popular languages, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And then one of the benefits of Python is just that the syntax is really short. You can get stuff done very quickly. It's not the fastest, but it's like quick to develop with.
Gotcha.
And that's a similar case with Pygame once you've built your own framework, which is what my situation is. So after enough time of using it, I've kind of built up my own set of scripts that I use, and eventually it turned into my own framework that I use. And I can make games actually a lot quicker nowadays than people using game engines. So there's all sorts of reasons you could want to use Pygame over a game engine. But in my case, because of where I am right now, it's just that I can make stuff faster with Pygame. There's some stuff that you can't really do with Pygame, and that's like some of the 3D stuff.
Right.
You can actually do shaders and some 3D stuff, but you start easing into using just OpenGL instead of Pygame, and that's something you can do. You can set up an OpenGL context in Pygame so that you can just be working with OpenGL with Python. And that's something I do with a lot of my games nowadays, so I can use shaders.
Gotcha.
And then I'll like render in Pygame, pass it into OpenGL, render it with shaders. So I do like a two-stage rendering thing. But yeah, so like I said, the main reason for using Pygame nowadays is just so I can work quicker. But for other engines and stuff, I have gotten into Godot because like for 3D stuff, I know how to do a lot of that stuff from scratch actually. And I actually have some examples where I have done that in Pygame and something called Modern GL.
Okay.
But it's just for 3D stuff, it's just too much to build yourself. And especially with what I want to do with Godot with VR stuff, that's not something I really want to mess with from scratch. So, Unity and Unreal I've tried, but I wasn't a huge fan of them. I do like Godot way more, so I don't have any reason to use Unity or Unreal at the moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, so it sounds like it for someone in your situation, maybe getting started would be a lot slower because you'd have to build up all your own frameworks. But now that you've already gone through that, as you say, you can build games a whole lot faster than someone who's using something like Unity or Unreal because you have, yeah, you've got your own framework that you probably understand superbly well, I would imagine, compared
Yeah,
to,
and
yeah,
part of the advantage of having your own framework is that you can build it to fit the needs of whatever you're working on. So game engines have to be made so that they fit the needs of pretty much everyone.
yeah,
Whereas if you're making your own thing, you know what types of games you're making, and you know how to structure everything so that you can make the types of games that you're making as efficiently as possible. So the more you kind of get into the specifics of what types of things you're making, the faster you'll be able to work, which is great.
gotcha. Yeah, because what you, your most popular video, what you said in there, I thought was really, really wise, actually. You said, what did you say? It depends on what your goals are, right? If your
Yeah.
goals are to just make games as quickly as possible and you're learning from scratch, then using an engine might be your better way to go. But if you have the time and you might want to be able to branch out into other things later on, then doing what you're doing might make a whole lot more sense. So, and I would agree with that 100%.
Yeah. And if you are planning on doing game development long term, I think you do need to pick up a game engine at some point, especially if you're working with other people. Like for example, if I wanted to collaborate with people, there's not very many to pick from. If I run into a game developer on the street, I'm not going to be able to work with them. And actually, something that came up recently was I got invited onto Blackthorn Prod's
Oh, the
like
Pass the Game challenge.
yeah,
Yeah.
the make the game without communicating thing. So I got invited onto that, and I was like, "Wait, aren't you guys using Unity?" And I think he, uh, either didn't cross his mind, or he just didn't know that I don't use Unity.
Ah, okay.
But I might go on if he does something with Godot in the future. But uh, yeah, if a lot of times if you just run into other game developers, you can't work with them.
Yeah.
So it is something you would probably need to pick up if your main interest is game development, and it's not just something you're doing for fun, kind of on the side. Um, and even if you do pick up those other engines, you can choose at that point which one you want to use. But it's good to know um, how to use game engines in that circumstance.
Makes sense. So I want to ask because, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but you've released two. I've got the names over here. You've released two commercial releases on Steam, right? Drawn, Drawn Down Abyss and Super Potato Bro. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, and they both have really overall positive reviews on Steam. So I'm just curious, um, because I haven't released anything yet, and I know a lot of people listening are probably in the stage where they're wanting to release something, but they're not there yet. So just what was your experience like releasing those games? Just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the first one actually, I'm trying to remember if this is a video that I already put out or if it was. No, I think it was in my Godot video. I mentioned that I was talking to someone in the Ludum Dare IRC, and just kind of the conversation came up of like making and selling games, and I don't remember exactly what was said, but something along the lines of like I think I mentioned that I could probably make a decent like I don't know like $100 is I think is what I said if I were to sell a game that I made. And then I think the guy said, well, then do it. I don't remember if it was encouragement or if he was kind of annoyed or something, but uh, I ended up doing it at like a look, and I made Super Potato Bra. I initially released it on itch.io. My expectations were really low, and this is something I recommend if you're releasing your first game, like if you're selling it, is to keep your expectations low.
Keep
Like I
expectations
said, I
low.
was going for $100. Um, so I released it on itch.io, and I just kind of promoted it on Reddit and a couple other places because I didn't have a YouTube following when I released either of those games.
Okay.
So I would promote it on Reddit, and I actually got like I think a few $100s in the first day. So I was like, hey, wait, this is enough to release it on Steam because it's $100 to release a game on Steam. So I
Yep.
went and did that, and then because I was marketing on Reddit, where it's like you just make a post and then a lot of like people will upvote it, and if as long as you have a reason to post, a lot of extra people are going to see it. So I had a second reason to post, and it did really well. Like the second post did really well, and a lot of people saw that. And So I had both the posts for the initial release and then the Steam release, and then that built up a fair amount of sales. So I ended up making, I think in total, over $3,000 from that game,
Nice.
which is pretty good for. Well, I mean, for most games, that's not very good. But I only put 100 hours into making that game. So when you actually do the math on that, that's actually pretty decent.
Yeah, it
And
is.
then the second game, Drawn Down Abyss, was 120 hours to make. So, and I got similar sales. So both of those returns were pretty good for what I did. But I think my main recommendation is to, I guess, keep your expectations low. Because especially your first game, you're probably not used to the amount of feedback you'll be getting and like just the types of things people will be annoyed by.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. Oh, sorry, Windows notification. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. And it's really dangerous to do that thing that I see a lot of people doing, where they'll quit their job and then try to make their dream game or something. Um, I've kept jobs on the side and kept kind of pursuing software engineering kind of as a backup plan. But the other thing I would recommend is to not forget about marketing because
Yep.
for a lot of games, it can be pretty good, and then no one sees it, no one plays it. And I think the most important time is like right when you release, there needs to be a marketing push because it's like, especially with the Steam algorithm and the way that things get promoted, a lot of it's kind of exponential. So like being able to put everything all in at once will probably get you more than just like putting in a small effort over time. It's good to build up so you can get a big push at the release, but that's it's important to be able to have that big push at the release. Anyways, um,
Sorry, for your second game, did you have a following by the time you made your second game on Steam? I wasn't
not
clear on that.
really.
Not really. Okay.
No. You can actually look at the release dates on my YouTube channel. I didn't really. I think I may have made a couple tutorials, but I didn't really have a following yet. I think it's like those videos maybe had like 100 views or something. Um, but so yeah, those ones I marketed purely by Reddit, and the great thing about Reddit is that it's merit based because people don't really follow people on Reddit. It's by subreddit. And people will upvote your post based on its quality. So if you don't have a following, Reddit's a great place. Although there's very limited communities where you can promote things to get eyes on them efficiently, and will that allow it. So it part of the game is figuring out which ones you can do that in. Um, some of the other marketing techniques are to like reach out to journalists and stuff, which I don't recommend anymore because no one really cares about journalists anymore. The more common thing nowadays is to reach out to YouTubers, which I didn't really have much success with. Um, I don't know too much about being successful with the marketing on that level from just kind of bare bones. You don't really have anything to start with aside from just using Reddit. Um, so my strategy has been to build up a following, and I think if you want to do this for a living, it's good to have a following so that you can release multiple games and people will come back and try that out. And I actually haven't released a game since I got a following on YouTube, which is interesting because I have no idea how much I would make if I did.
Do you plan
And
on making another one?
I'm hoping to soon-ish. So uh, yeah, I would recommend if you can to try to get an actual following if you're trying to do this for a living or something.
Yeah.
And that way you can bring people back to your work, and you don't have to think as hard about marketing, and it's not as, I guess, luck based. It takes the luck out of it. I feel like, which is why I've done that. Well, part of why I have other reasons for making my YouTube channel, but yeah.
There's a lot of good reasons. You can also just provide yourself a small income on the side as well with it, whether it's through
Yep.
sponsorships or ad revenues. Not very much unless you have like a crap ton of views, but it's there's so many good reasons for building a following. So yeah, I agree 100%. Do you mind if I ask you about your development process of either one of your games, just in terms of if you have like a memory of um, I'm curious as to whether you have a really particular memory in terms of a really high point, like something that you're just really, really proud of, or something, some new system you made or framework, or something just a really high point, and also just a really like, did you have any super, super low points? I'm just always curious about those kind of stories.
Yeah. So for low points, I think it's usually whenever I have to start making actual content for games. I really like making uh, the mechanics and just like the coding aspect, but once I have to sit down and make like hundreds of assets or something like that,
You're a
that gets really
programmer
tedious.
first.
Yeah, I am.
Yep.
And like I mentioned before, I got into art because I was into starting to get into game development from a
Right.
programming standpoint. So,
Right.
uh, yeah, I do get bored of art if I do it for too long. And it's not just that because content can be other things. And what happened with Super Potato Bra was that I would have to sit there for hours making levels and like just in a level editor, and that gets really repetitive and boring, I think.
Yep.
So I mean, like the first couple are fun to do, but then once you've done like 20 of them, it gets really repetitive, and that's probably the most unenjoyable part of the experience for me.
Did you have any trouble with like keeping yourself motivated while you were going through that?
So for Super Potato Bra, I actually had like a schedule. It was like this day I'm gonna make these levels, and like I had it planned out, and it was like I only had to do it for a couple weeks, and I was gonna be done because, like I mentioned, it was 100 hours of work. So, um, uh, that helps, but for a lot of projects that are larger, I get pretty bored working on the content, which is one of the biggest hurdles for me when releasing games. So nowadays, I've pretty much just gotten used to the idea that that's a problem for me. So what I'm doing instead is I'm designing my games with that in mind, so that I don't have to spend a lot of time working on content, and it's more about working on the mechanics and other stuff.
Gotcha.
So like one of my main single player project right now is like a it has automatic like world generation and stuff like that, so I don't have to create too like it uses preset areas, but I don't have to create too many of them, and it kind of stitches them together, and a lot of it's kind of procedural.
Nice.
So that way I don't have to spend too much time on content. I'll have to create lots of enemies and stuff, but I mean I had to do the same thing for Drawn Down Abyss, and the focus is going to be more on the mechanics and kind of the roguelike elements, and that way I don't have to deal with that content hurdle too much. And then my other main project right now is a online multiplayer racing thing that's like Mario Kart, and that thing. Sorry, there's a lot more. Yeah, that project I don't have to do too much content for. Most of the time, I'm working on like mechanics, netcode, stuff like that, and the tedious part is like making tracks, but I can just take it one at a time, and just like make a course in like a couple hours, and then not have to worry about that for a while because I don't need that many of them either. So that's another nice project I have for that. Um, for the high points, I think it's just kind of whenever, well, definitely when I release the games and like they do well. That's the best part, I
Yep.
think. But in the actual development process, the high point for me is probably when I finish like the core mechanics and I can start seeing the game take shape.
Yep. That's
Yeah.
like that's a really really fun stage. So you've created two commercial releases, and you've got all sorts of other small projects under your belt as well. So just for anyone who's listening that is working towards their first commercial release right now, you've already given a lot of advice, but what further advice would you give them, just in terms of anything, expectations? Just what kind of advice would you give somebody if they asked you?
Well, I've already mentioned a lot of the stuff with the actual release of a game, that like my thoughts on that. But for the development, I think well, a lot of it's going to depend on how you started your development. I think once you started, there's not a whole lot you can change unless you restart or you make some serious changes to what you're planning on doing. But I think the big things are keep your scope small, which everyone says, and I mean, there's a reason everyone says it.
Yep.
But and I mean, a, a lot of game development, like in just any type of large project, is going to depend a fair amount on discipline to actually finish stuff. If you're counting on just natural motivation, unless you're some lucky few or something, you're probably not going to do very well. So I think it's really important to have the discipline to work on things even when you don't want to.
Yep.
And like with my first game, like I said, there was all the level editing stuff, and like I mentioned, I had to set up that like schedule, and it was like I just have to get through these couple of weeks, and then it's done. And so yeah, I think discipline's pretty important for that.
Yep. I'm so here. I'm so glad to hear someone else talking about this, because there's a whole lot of parts about game development that are so unglamorous, and a lot of them are really really boring.
Yeah,
Honestly. So yeah, you kind of just have to find it in yourself to be able to power through some of that more boring stuff. And everybody's got different preferences, but yeah, for you it's level building, so you get to that stage and it's like, oh my god, yeah, it takes you a couple of weeks to get
yeah,
through it, but you just power through, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and it helps if you have a track record of making money to think about it from a okay, I am at least going to probably get paid for this, so you can kind of treat it like a job at that point. So like that helps. And that's what happened with Drawn Down Abyss, where there's some stuff where I was powering through it because I had to make like there was like 50 something cards, I don't remember. So I had to like power through adding all of those. um, yeah, that stage will exist for any game, even though nowadays I'm working on reducing the size of that stage. But yeah,
Gotcha. So, I was looking at your itch.io page and you have a big long collection of games on there, and I'm just curious. I assume a lot of them, probably not all of them, but a lot of them are probably game jam entries, right? So
yeah.
I'm just curious, in terms of, especially for people that are listening that are a lot newer in the game dev space. I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on how important, from your own personal opinion, how important are participating in game jams for experience, for building skills, all that stuff.
Yeah, I think they're really important. I've been meaning to make a video about this for I think years actually. I just haven't gotten around to it. I think it's one of the most important things you can do as a game developer, especially like it's a bit different if you're trying to get into a company, but if you're planning on like working in a small indie team or if you're working for yourself, I think it's really important to do game jams because for those who don't know, in game jams, you make a game in a short period of time. You're given a theme, and sometimes you have the rules are that you have to work by yourself and create everything from scratch. Sometimes you can work with a team. Sometimes you can use even pre-existing assets. I prefer to do ones where I have to make everything from scratch by myself.
Yep.
But it's a great learning experience because it takes you through the whole process for game development, uh, like beginning to end, and you get to learn different things about the different stages. If you're working on big projects, um, you have to finish your first big project before you get like you can get to your second project where you have the experience of what the back end is like. Whereas if you do game jams and you've done those small projects, you have more experience in that area. And game jams are also great because the time frame kind of forces you to get it done in a short period of time. And if you have a problem with finishing stuff, it's like one of the best ways to get stuff done. So if you even have problems getting done with short projects, I think game jams are probably the easiest way to get stuff done. They sound intimidating, but as long as you plan your scope correctly, it's not too hard. And the other aspect of game jams is that after you finish your game, you get to see what other people did with that same idea, and then people will give you feedback on your games, which is something that's very valuable early on and very hard to get early on.
Yes.
Unless you have a lot of friends. Well, actually, the problem with friends is they're probably gonna not give you the best feedback
They'll
because
just be
they don't
nice.
want to. Yeah, they'll be nice, and then also oftentimes they don't have. It's hard to find people that have experience with indie games and like know what's good, what's not, and stuff like that.
Yep.
Whereas if you're doing gyms, there's lots of people that have lots of experience in that area and can give you some really good feedback. And I think those are the two big things. And I also do like how in most game jams you get ratings, so you can kind of see how you've progressed over time. So I can see that my ratings have slowly gone up over time, which is cool to see. They're not entirely accurate, of course, but it's just good to improve your skills, get feedback, and just kind of see how you've grown over time. So it has a lot of use cases.
Yep. And how do you find working under really tight time constraints? Like, does that limit your, does that hinder you or does it actually help you? Because I know that sometimes the creative process can be, sometimes putting limits on it can actually make it a little bit easier to like come up with ideas and whatnot. And I'm also curious, just, have you ever entered a game jam and not been able to finish in time because maybe you overscoped or something like that?
Um, so for the overscoping thing, I don't think that's really been my problem with the. There's been, I think, one or two game jams I didn't finish, and it's usually because I lose interest rather than the scoping an issue.
Gotcha.
What you should be doing it when you're designing game jam games is to design it so that if you do need to cut the scope so that you can finish, it doesn't like completely break the game. So it's good to have solid basic mechanics that you can build off of. And then what I like to do is save the extra content in polishing. Well, actually, I do a lot of polishing earlier, but some of the polishing is saved for the end, and especially the content, so that I can just cut it easily if I misjudge the scope. But yeah, I think working under those time constraints helps me because um, well, I do sometimes get bored with projects as well, so it just helps me stick to things and finish it. So I've done like 20 something, actually, I don't know, maybe if it's almost 30 game jams now. Um, so they definitely help me get stuff out because I'll do like maybe 2 or 3 a year. And so they're like 90 something percent of the games that I've released. And I think I, like I mentioned, there's only one or two where I didn't actually end up releasing something.
Okay.
So I think as long as you plan it out right at the beginning, it's not too hard to finish what something that's playable.
Do you often work it out on paper? Whether
I did once.
Okay.
I think it can be useful to do it that way, but I've done enough game jams now where I can, for especially for something that's the scope of a game jam game, I can do it in my head.
Okay.
And I think one of the skills that game jams gave me is the ability to test out game ideas in my head and just kind of play it in my head and see what works and what doesn't. Um, Although I do make a lot of mistakes still, and you can see that in some of my games. Usually it's actually control related, because specifically I have a track record of having bad controls in some of my, I guess, games from a few years back. But I think more recently people have been a lot more happy with my games.
Are you talking, just so that I'm clear, are you talking from a design perspective? You're thinking of an idea in your mind, and then it's given you the skill to be able to figure out whether that design aspect for your game is good before you actually implement it?
Yes, so
Okay.
it's like the whole game design. So you, like the way I do it is I just kind of, well, usually I start with a theme and I try to think of an interesting mechanic based on that theme. And then I try to figure out how to turn that mechanic into a game.
Gotcha.
And then you have to be able to kind of play through it in your head, look for places where this might, or where a mechanic might be abused or something. Because a lot of times mechanics don't fit together very nicely. So you have to be able to tell what would and wouldn't work and be able to work from there. If you have to make the whole game or prototype the whole thing, in order to figure it out, you're going to waste a lot of time.
Right.
And it's especially important in game jams, which is why it's good for picking up that skill. But for big games as well, especially for like, you can't prototype everything in a very short amount of time unless it's one of those games where it's like simple mechanics and there's just a lot of content. But it's just a useful skill to have.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I want to ask about your YouTube channel because, and we already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to elaborate on it some because you have a successful YouTube channel. I think you're at like 54,000 subscribers, I want to say, but that's off the top of my head. I could be wrong. But
Yeah, something like that.
you're around that mark. Yeah. Um, so in terms of, if someone were wanting to, if you wanted to, I know you're not full time, but if you wanted to be a full time game developer and make a living just off of like game dev related stuff, whether that be your YouTube as well as game sales, obviously, just how important do you think it is to have a YouTube channel specifically? Because there's so many things you can do for marketing, and I feel like at least a lot of the people that I know, they go into this with this idea of I need to have a YouTube channel. And I'm always curious to hear what other people's perspectives are. Keeping in mind that you have a YouTube channel, so you're probably a little bit biased there.
Yeah, so, well, like I mentioned before, YouTube really helps with marketing, I think. But also, there's the aspect of just getting free play testing.
Yep.
So, normally, if you want idea tested, well, one technique I've seen people use is to just enter game jams. And then kind of adapt their idea to the game jam, or sometimes there's
Oh,
game jams that don't have a theme, so they can just get feedback.
that's interesting.
But
I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah, so YouTube's like a pretty decent way to get feedback for your game. So like I've been doing play tests for my racing game recently. And we had like on the last time one we had I think like 13 or 14, oh, no, we had like 12 people, and then the next one we might have like 30 something.
Nice.
Um, but it's just really good for getting feedback. It's good for marketing, but I don't think it's a necessity. I think it just makes it. I probably less stressful in a sense because you have a way to market your game and just get eyes on it. And then if at that point it doesn't do very well, you know it's because of the game and not because of the marketing. So it's just nice to have. Like I said, I don't think it's essential. There are other ways to market games,
Yep.
but it's useful to have it. And I think if you look for any marketing guide, they will recommend you build a social media following. Well, marketing guide for game development. Um, but yeah,
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and game development as well as YouTube, they're both like uh, they're both really really hard to get into. It's hard to make money in game development. It's hard to make a name for yourself, and on YouTube, you know, it takes a whole lot of work to actually build up your subscriber base and you know, I'm sure. And so for someone that is listening, that's wanting to get into doing both at the same time, what advice would you give them? What are the pros and cons in your mind? Because there's definitely cons to doing both at the same time. I'm just curious to hear your perspective on that.
yeah. So for the cons, I mean, definitely the biggest thing is just the time sink. I think if you're getting into it, it's important to think about how you want to approach YouTube. So there's a couple different techniques, and I mentioned this before. There are people that make uh, YouTube videos about the things, the game development stuff they're working on. That's like the devlogs and stuff.
Yep.
But not all devlogs actually fall into that category. The other thing is that there are people that make content or make games and stuff to make YouTube videos. And that's the easy way to become successful on YouTube. Because I mean, obviously, if you're focusing on YouTube and making stuff for YouTube, it'll do a lot better as opposed to just making stuff about whatever you're working on. But
Yes.
that has a huge impact on where you put your time. And so you mentioned CodeBullet before. He makes his stuff primarily for YouTube. Um, whereas, trying to think off the top of my head, there's like a game that released not so long ago. It was Punch a Bunch, I think. I forgot what the YouTuber was that made it, but
Ponty
he
Pants.
was focused.
Pawnee Pants, right?
Uh, Maybe I think so. But he was focusing on the devlog side, and so you can tell, I think, from the game release that he put more effort into the game than YouTube. So it's important to think about that, and it will affect your growth. And then also something to consider if you're trying to build an audience is that going straight into devlogs is actually not a very reliable method for building an audience. Something you'll see from a lot of the people in this like space of YouTube is that they actually just got started with tutorials. So
Yep.
like if you look at Danny, he got started with tutorials. If you look at someone like Michael Reeves, he got started with tutorials.
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh, and also Michael Reeves has a video where he used Pygame, um, yeah, a lot of people get started with tutorials, and I think it's one of the more reliable ways to get started if you want to do that, and then you just kind of shift into game development. And yeah, that's just really helpful. But I think we've already discussed, I think, the pros of it, and
Yep.
yeah, like I said, the cons are just the time sink. And I mean, it's not just the time you're spending making the videos, it's also just learning how to make videos, managing it all. So it does take a fair bit of time. Right now, I'm spending uh, probably averaging 2 to 3 hours a week, so it's a pretty small commitment for me
Yeah.
right now. Actually, maybe less. It might be 2 hours. But uh, you can tell like my growth has not been great in the last couple of years. It's just been very slow and steady because I've just put in a couple hours here and there. Um, so yeah, it's just I think the big thing is just consider how much you want to actually invest in doing that.
So I'm curious then, because I also make tutorials on my channel for Unity specifically, and when I got started, or before I started making tutorials, I was like really really nervous that like I don't know enough. I don't know enough to be
Yeah.
teaching other people how to be doing this. I feel like I'm a beginner myself, and I wouldn't say that anymore by any means. I'm somewhere in the intermediate category, I would think. But for someone who wants to get started and maybe they're thinking that they don't know enough to make tutorials, what would you say to someone like that?
Well, so for a lot of things, there's a situation of it works. If it works, it works. So I think that even if you don't know what you're using too well, you could still make tutorials. I think there's certain types of tutorials that are easier to make if you don't think you have the knowledge for certain types of things. So if you're like doing specific how-tos, like how to implement this specific thing, that's something that's really easy to do. Like, I mean, like I said, if it works, it works. So
Yep.
for those types of tutorials, I think almost anyone can do it as long as you can actually make the thing. And then you can start working your way into more general stuff as you learn more. But I mean, it's not like a huge loss if you make a tutorial that's not that great.
Yep.
I tried to avoid it, but it doesn't hurt too much. Ideally, it just wouldn't get promoted as much in the algorithm, and then you can just forget about it.
Yep.
But
For myself, I just kind of bouncing off of what you've said. Um, I find that for tutorials, I would say it's made me a lot better, a lot more quickly, in a really weird roundabout way. I think because I end up sinking a lot more time than I otherwise would when I'm making something if I know that other people are going to be watching it. So I'm like, oh, this thing, if I was working on it just for me, I would call it good enough right here. But because I know other people are going to be watching, it's kind of like, well, I should probably take it one step further, cover all the edge cases, et cetera, et cetera. Like, yeah, I just find another pro, just from my own perspective, another pro is that it's helped me in my learning stage. Is just you learn best when you're trying to teach other people things, I think.
yeah, I think there's a pretty common, I don't know what the exact saying is, but there's something along the lines of like the best way to learn is to teach. So,
Yep. Yep.
um, it does, if you're trying to make something good, you will probably end up learning what you're talking about a lot better than you otherwise would have if you were just trying to use it. So, it's very helpful to teach that stuff. Um, I think at that stage where you're learning to make the tutorial more so than making a tutorial off of what you already know, I think it's in the area where the quality might not be the highest, but if the in that circumstance, if the audience is not benefiting from it as much, you're probably benefiting from it more. So it's like someone's going to be benefiting. It's either going to be your audience or you, I
Yep.
think, because if you don't really have the knowledge in it yet, you have to pick it up. So, and then of course you can get both, I guess, if you pick it up really well. But you're probably going to miss some stuff if you're trying to do it for that purpose.
Right.
So, but
Gotcha.
like the main idea is there's a benefit on both sides, regardless of your skill level on that.
Yep. Yep. So you and I have been talking. We talked a little bit about motivation, and I'm just curious because there are some people that are in the game development space that might not have the most supportive like circle of people around them. Some people flat out think that it's like a stupid, childish thing to do. Some people think there's no money in it, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone's got different goals. I know that you're not a full-time game developer, but like regardless, having trying to work on something, especially if you're trying to make it like you want to be a full-time indie developer, it can be really, really discouraging to be in that kind of a situation. So if there's someone out there that doesn't feel like they get a whole lot of outside support for their goals, for what they're wanting to do, what would you say to that person?
Well, I think to some extent, I think this is similar to the whole discipline and motivation discussion. I think if you don't have the discipline to work on something, even when people aren't supporting you all the time, you might be setting yourself up to fail. I mean, if you have really supportive friends and a community, that's great. But I think if you're thinking about this from a business standpoint, you're not going to want to be dependent on that in case something happens. I in when I got started, my well, actually not necessarily when I got started. I got started and then like a couple of years later, I mentioned to my parents that like I was interested. I didn't even say I was going to necessarily do it. I just wanted to try and see if I could do game development for a living.
Yep.
And my mother was not happy about that. It was kind of what you said. She thought there was no money in it and not something you could do, and especially not by yourself.
Yeah.
And then I kind of took that as a challenge. Um,
Yep.
and yeah, I mean, my family's been otherwise supportive. It's just that I think my parents didn't quite get it at first.
There's a lack of
Um,
understanding from a lot of people, I
yeah.
think. Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, nowadays I am in a situation where if I wanted to, I could just move somewhere with a lower cost of living and I could live off of the stuff that I do in my own time. So like my game development, my YouTube, stuff like that. So I feel like I've already made it to some extent. But right now, like the situation is like that I'm looking for a bit more money than that. So I'm
Understandable.
considering doing part-time my own stuff, part-time software engineering. That's what I'm kind of looking at right now.
Gotcha.
But yeah, back to what I was mainly saying though, I think if you don't look, if you need people to be constantly supporting you, you're setting yourself up to fail. So it's important to develop that discipline. If you can't, then game development not might not be the right thing for you. Um, and I mean, it's perfectly fine to just do it when you feel like it for fun, but then at that point, you have to keep in mind that it is a hobby, and you're probably not going to be doing it for a living.
Right. Right. So just to sum everything up, because I know that we've talked a lot about a lot of this stuff already a little bit, but if someone is at day zero and they want to get into game development and you're sitting across from them and they ask you personally, what should I do? Where should I start? I want to go from where I'm at now, which is knowing absolutely nothing. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where to start, and I want to be a full-time indie developer. What would you tell them?
Yeah. So for that, I actually had a video about how to get into game development. I think I don't remember what the exact title was. It's the one with the thumbnail where it's like where it says beginner to Steam or something like that.
Okay.
But it's one of my more popular ones. But you mentioned going straight into like full-time indie game development. Um, so one of the things to consider is if you actually want to do full-time indie game development or not. Like I mentioned, that affects what you learn specifically if you're learning an engine or to build stuff from scratch. And then, so something I'm going to ask for some clarification on is that full-time indie working by yourself or full-time indie working with a team or both that
let's
you're looking for an
let's
answer on?
say by yourself, but they're open to working with publishers. They're open to doing a
Yeah.
Kickstarter. They just but solo. Let's go solo.
Okay. So yeah, in that case, I would say, well, probably pick up a game engine. It's hard to say which one to use right now. You would have to research it yourself. It depends on the type of game you're making. You can look into those different things, and then you just kind of start making stuff. Just I guess start with whatever tutorial series you can find, and then just start to learn from there, modify things, make sure you understand what's happening in the tutorials you're learning from, so that you can actually build things off of what you've seen. If
Hmm.
you have to follow tutorials for everything, you're not really learning. You're learning when you can watch a tutorial and then you can do other things with what you've learned in that tutorial.
Yes.
So it's important to be able to figure out how to do that. So it's great to play around with stuff and just kind of figure out how everything works. And then I think aside from, well, that I've mentioned in my videos that idea of being reliant on tutorials completely is called tutorial hell. So that's one of the big focuses for a new developers to get out of that, because that's kind of what people default to.
I was stuck there for a
Some
long time.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's like the biggest thing I think. And then, as I mentioned before, I got into pixel art because I didn't want to hire other people. So if you're planning on working by yourself, you might as well start learning those skills pretty much as soon as you start. So if you're making a 2D game, start learning art. And then if you're making a 3D game, start learning 3D modeling. You might as well start learning to compose music. Maybe get into Foley a bit, which is where you start making sounds and record them with a microphone for sound effects and stuff like that. There are free assets you can use for sound that are pretty good, though. But yeah, if you're planning on going solo, I think it's important to pick up all of the skills, and you need to be open to the idea that you're going to have to pick up tons of skills. And it's not just like the music, the art, and the code, but you're also going to have to, unless you get a deal with a publisher, you're going to have to figure out marketing and stuff like that as well. And then you have your, if you're doing it as a business, you have to figure out your own like things from a business standpoint. So you have to learn about setting up an LLC and dealing with taxes and stuff like that. So there's a lot that goes into it. So going from not knowing anything to being a full-time indie developer working solo is, I think, maybe one of the harder things you could do in life. Like, it's a lot harder than I think getting into most other fields, and then the returns aren't as great. So you have to be doing it out of like a passion for game development, I think.
Yeah. And be prepared to wear hundreds of different hats, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome, man. Thank you so much. I just want to give you an opportunity if there's anything that you'd like to share, whether it's in terms of any last words you want to say, or if you want to throw a self-promotion in there, if there's anything you're working on, anything anybody should wish list. I definitely recommend that people go and check out your YouTube channel, which is DaFluffyPotato. But yeah, I'll open it up to you.
Yeah, so I don't have any like Steam projects to promote right now or anything. I have some stuff in the works, but nothing with a Steam page yet. If you want to follow my work, like you mentioned, you can go to my YouTube channel. And lately, I've been like in the last couple of weeks, I've been doing playtests for multiplayer racing games. So if you're interested in joining that, you can join my Discord server. Which there's a link to on my channel's videos, or I can send you a link to put in the description.
Yes, please
But
do that.
yeah,
I'll include it in the description of this video and this podcast as
right.
well.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. You're so welcome. Thank you for joining me. It's been a blast. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye. I want to give a very special thank you to all of our Hall of Fame patrons: Jakob Yondok, Throbbing Wind, Christopher Nichols, Zondra Kessler, Fontaine Waite, Brainwaves to Binary, Couch, Dan Brooking, and Ian Oral, as well as our early access patrons: Ken Waite, Mason Crow, Mr. D, Neil, Juan, Liquid Egg, Alexander Prestis, Varagon Studios, Godsworn, Abdulaziz Hamad Alanazi, Ober, Bill Guo, Alone on Mars, Code Jutsu, Ayush Sharma, Alex Friedman, Felipe Gomez dos Santos, Mario Android Dev, Rui Sousa, and Danny X. If you choose to support us on Patreon, you can get early access to all of our YouTube videos, monthly alpha builds, and more.